take a look at a video.
When I first was hit with the slavery issue, I remember exactly where it was. It was University of Texas, Austin, a bunch of grad students who were really after me. The Bible does not come out and just flat out condemn slavery right from the beginning. And, I said, okay, fine. I hadn't really thought about it. So I went back and talked with some Christians who are far more intelligent and well-read than I am, and they helped me begin to work it through. But I still struggled with it. And it's been now 40 years since that time, and the more I've thought it through, the more I am at peace with it. The Bible never endorses slavery.
So this is entirely false. The Bible quite openly and explicitly endorses slavery, and this is the passage where that happens, Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. Now, the passages leading up to verse 44 are explaining that you should not treat a debt slave who is a native Israelite harshly. You should treat them more like a hired worker than like an enslaved person. So that is the rule for native Israelites. And then we're going to get to the rule for non-natives, where it is addressing chattel slavery, where the slaves are your property and you can treat them how you want. And verse 44 begins, as for the male and female slaves whom you may have, and this does not mean whom you might happen to already possess. It means whom you are allowed to own. It is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you and from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land. They may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves. But as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. So this quite explicitly is sanctioning chattel slavery. All it's saying is it needs to be non-Israelites that you purchase and use as chattel slaves. It cannot be your fellow Israelites. Only debt slavery is reserved for native Israelites, and you must treat them more like hired workers than like enslaved people. This is a quite explicit endorsement of chattel slavery, and it does regulate it because all societies that practice slavery regulate it, but there's not really a case to make that this does not constitute an open and an explicit endorsement of slavery unless one wants to fiddle with the definition of endorse so that they can sidestep what quite clearly qualifies as an open and an explicit endorsement of slavery.
The Bible gives us instructions on how cultures where slavery was rampant.
So I don't know what Cliff was going to go on to say because that's not a complete sentence, but this video that I was tagged in doesn't present any more of that sentence. It just shares that. And if the idea is that the Bible talks about how to engage with other nations regarding their slavery, or that the Bible describes how other nations engage in slavery or anything related to that, that would be entirely untrue. As we've seen in Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46, the Bible quite openly and explicitly endorses chattel slavery. It tells the Israelites they are allowed to practice chattel slavery as long as it is non-Israelites they are purchasing to possess, to use, to pass on as inheritance perpetually. That is an explicit endorsement of chattel slavery.
And when Paul writes, slaves obey your masters, he's not saying that slavery is good.
But he also doesn't say that it's bad. He also never says that it should go away. He accepts its normativity and its authority, and he never says anything that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever is a direct challenge to that normativity or that authority. This is a social institution that Paul accepts. So while Paul himself may never explicitly endorse it, he unilaterally condones it and never leverages his authority to in any way, shape, or form whatsoever question or challenge or condemn that institution.
The Bible is pro-slavery. I mean, baloney. The second greatest miracle in the Old Testament was God and the Exodus, delivering the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt.
The story of God delivering the Israelites from enslavement to Egypt is not an anti-slavery story. It is an anti-enslavement of us story, because Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46 are a part of that larger narrative, and that explicitly endorses the enslavement of others. And we have the same kind of thing going on in the pre-Civil War United States, where white folks enslaved black folks. Slavery was racially determined, and so you did not have, for instance, black folks enslaving white folks. And in instances where white folks were enslaved, it was conceptualized in a very different way, and white folks had a lot more rights because this was a racially divided practice. And in the Bible, it is an ethnically divided practice where we don't want Israelites to be enslaved, or if they are going to be enslaved, it's going to be conceptualized differently, and they're going to have more rights, but non-Israelites can be enslaved, can be chattel slaves, can be treated harshly, can be property. There's not really much of a distinction here. And so if you say the fact that the Bible doesn't like when Israelites are enslaved means it is not pro-slavery, then we have to say that the pre-Civil War United States was also not pro-slavery. And that would be absolutely laughable. They are both pro-slavery. They're just anti the enslavement of us.
And what Paul writes in the letter of Philemon is, hey Philemon, I met your runaway slave Onesimus in prison. I led him to faith, and now I'm going to send him back to you. And you're not to accept him back as a runaway slave. You're going to accept him back as a brother in Christ. And if you got problems with that, I'll pay.
So this is also not an anti-slavery stance. This is still an entirely pro-slavery stance. Paul is still operating within and honoring the boundaries, the expectations, the normativity, the authority of the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. There's a spectrum of ways to interpret what Paul is asking of Philemon. On the conservative end, at best, Paul is gently suggesting Philemon manumit Onesimus, which is not a condemnation or even a questioning of the practice of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. Manumission happened even in the pre-Civil War United States. The other end of that spectrum understands Paul to be suggesting to Philemon that he treat Onesimus a lot better, treat him like a brother rather than like a slave, which would align with what we see in Leviticus, where in prescribing how Israelite debt slaves are to be treated, the text says, don't treat them like a slave, treat them like a hired worker. That is not to say they are not debt slaves. It is just to say you should treat them better. And that would align with statements we find in the Deutero-Pauline epistles, where Paul, again, without questioning, condemning, or in any way whatsoever undermining the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings, Paul suggests that enslavers keep in mind that both they and their enslaved folks both have the same master in Jesus, and so should treat each other accordingly. That's just Paul saying, treat each other nicely. That is not Paul saying there's a problem with the practice of slavery. There is nothing anywhere in any part of the Bible that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever indicates a problem with the practice of buying, selling, and owning other human beings, because the Bible unilaterally condones and in some places even explicitly endorses slavery.